to be here today. Well, I'm very excited to turn the floor over very shortly to Imhotep, who is a youth development practitioner who has worked here in Baltimore and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador. So he has a breadth of experience that's global. And you guys are going to learn a lot from hearing from him. I just want to say briefly, as an investigative reporter and a journalist and now an editor who's covered youth justice for 20 years in this country, the old conversation about crime and punishment is now a public health story. We've had a dramatic shift in the way we view how we fight crime, and it's rooted in history. It's rooted in historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, systemic racism, entrenched poverty. All of these things play into crime, right? And when we revision that, we treat youth in their communities and in their families and among people who love them and care for them. And then we have a safe society. So just finally, I'll just say that 20 years ago, when my first investigative project was on the California Youth Authority, which at that point was the largest youth prison system in the nation, possibly the world, with 10,000 children and young teens incarcerated. In June, it was shut down. So this is a really cool conversation because you have seated before you here a youth development practitioner. And if you can just tell, I'm really curious, and I'm sure these folks are as well, what is that? Tell us some more about that role.
Sure. So I think a youth development practitioner is a really cool jargon or technical term just to kind of convey and impart an individual myself who has lived experience kind of overcoming some of the circumstances and challenges faced by the population we're referring to, youth and young adults between the ages of 16 and 24, but who's also kind of learned notable lessons as it pertains to some of those challenges, and as a result, who has kind of dedicated a notable portion of his career thus far, going on 13, 14 years-ish, depending on if you consider like high school and when I didn't necessarily have a resume, to really just uplift and complement youth as they kind of go through their respective journeys to add value and really amplify some of the assets they have as fellow humans with their own respective capabilities and strengths.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important to note what the definition of youth has become, because with the additional brain science and all that we've done with brain imaging and adolescent medicine, we really know that youth and the frontal lobe development does extend well into the mid-20s. So at the Imprint, which is our nonprofit news outlet, we call youth folks who are well into their 20s and even pushing 30 sometime, and I know because I have adult children. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about this notion of disconnection, which is a kind of a buzzword, but as it pertains to your work, how would you define the disconnected youth of today?
Sure. So that's a great question. I think when we were kind of talking through this, prior to kind of doing some research, I was like, disconnection from what? I feel like it's pretty obvious from the juvenile justice system. However, after doing my due diligence and a public health lens, I think it kind of refers to this population again, once again, youth and young adults between the ages of 16 and 24 being disconnected from school and work. And so I think when thinking about academics and the school component, I think that unfortunately, and I'm sure research kind of backs and support this, that when youth, essentially they aren't essentially excelling in academic settings, unfortunately, due to, a lack of adequate support in the home and academic settings for a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, this kind of contributes to disconnection from those academic spaces, and I think that unfortunately, when there is a disconnection, youth and young adults then kind of return to their communities. I think this is also amplified by the fact that when you're 16 to 24, there is an abundance of responsibilities, right? So as the previous panel shared, pardon me, you know, youth and young adults are siblings, right? And therefore they have to care for younger ones. As you become a youth and young adult, there are so many competing priorities. You obtain expenditures, whether that's, you know, a cell phone bill, if you're an artist, entrepreneur trying to invest, not to mention just basic upkeeping, right? We all want to be dressed to the nine and respectfully presentable, and not to mention the notable reality that they're also parents occasionally. And so when you think about these factors, a disconnection from school, competing responsibilities, and returning to your communities where you may not have the idealistic, positive and healthy adults, I think that occasionally youth and young adults kind of become engaged in informal economies occasionally. And these are tangible things that are in their communities because sometimes the doctors, lawyers, and so forth aren't necessarily there to provide that counsel. They engage in what's tangible, and this kind of correlates directly to system involvement.
Right, right. And what are the approaches that you found to be most successful with re-engaging or complementing the youth to overcome some of the obstacles that sounds like are really deeply entrenched in poverty a lot of times?
Certainly, and I apologize, Karen, if I may just backtrack for one brief second
Absolutely.
before addressing your inquiry. I think it's really notable to also flag, I think I forgot the component as it pertains to work. I think there's no mystery that when youth and young adults kind of become system involved, thinking about the work component, I think pre-system involvement, there's this kind of confliction between low wage returns as it pertains to basic blue collar opportunities. We're in a blue collar city, and the competing perceived notion of high wage returns in informal economies. I think that's the pre-system involvement notion. And then post-system, I think it's kind of some of the hindering challenges of probation and parole that hinder where you can go, the extent in which you can stay out when maybe working blue collar roles, such as the people who are complementing all of us here to obtain our coffee, tea, and whatnot. And then in addition to that, I think it's the kind of notable component of just a lack of workforce skills due to confinement and such, and not that holistic kind of root cause approach being poured into them. And then lastly, it's just a kind of component of a lack of formal education due to that system involvement as well. So
No, that's
I
cool.
wanted to address that.
Please.
But yeah, when thinking about some of the practice, two things come to mind. I think group and one-on-one mentoring has been a kind of preferred tool of choice when thinking about enhancing the life skills and leadership development of youth and young adults, but also restorative practices. I think those are the two principal tools that have been complementary, and I think it's also notable to be mindful that when I think a lot of times in the systems component, things are very much punitive as opposed to focusing on the root cause and restorative. And the last thing I'll just flag is that I think when thinking about the demographics and the populations who compromise a fair majority of the systems, these are people who fit into the jargon of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I think that a lot of the punitive practices aren't necessarily aligned with some of the ancestral practices of those people that are much connected to indigenous and restorative practices, and so there's a disconnect.
I don't think anyone could have said it any better. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Fortunately, we're out of time, but you nailed it. So thank you. Thank you. They are not playing with these time frames. They're very short. And we also lost a panelist, so I'm glad that you have more time. Thank you very much. It was really my honor to speak with you today.